Welcome to our last unit. We're now less than a month away from the AP exam, and alas, we have a lot of art to cover still. But before I dive into our final unit, let me say a few words about the endgame. We have 5 scheduled review days, which will include 2 semester finals, a second semester final, and an actual AP exam from the new curriculum. You will have seen all of these questions before. We will open unit tests for review the weekend before the first semester final. I'll also be putting up review quizzes on Moodle. As with the matching quizzes, you can take these as many times as you want. Some of them will show up as actual quizzes during the review days. And on to the art of the late 20th and early 21st century. At this point in our story, which means the end of the Second World War, the center of the art world moves from Paris to New York City. These cartoons come from the New Yorker magazine. Our introduction to this brave new world comes from our favorite art historian, Sister Wendy. You just saw Jackson Pollock in action. I'm really quite amazed that he dropped from the list, since his technique and his artistic philosophy had enormous influence on the art that we'll study in this unit. Pollock used to be an AP favorite, so here's an old exam question that I want you to discuss for a minute, again, because his description of his method is relevant to the 2 required works we're about to see. Don't worry about the specific question the College Board asked in 2008. Instead, what I want you to talk about is what is new and different about his approach to painting. So here's an excerpt from the College Board's grading rubric for this question. What, based on this quote, were some of the characteristics of the New York school that Pollock embodied? Well, he employed gestural abstraction, or what came to be called action painting. His work had an all-over composition, which means it lacked what? It lacks a focal point. There is an emphasis on motion and rhythm, and there's a kind of tension between control and improvisation. These artists painted on a large scale, as Sister Wendy pointed out. Or in art speak, they employed monumentality. The medium was non-traditional, house paint and not paint out of a tube. And finally, the College Board uses the phrase non-objective expression of the self. What I think this means in plain English is that Pollock thought his action painting captured his inner spirit, but also his participation in the collective unconscious. So what earlier art historical painting tradition does this fit into? The emphasis on inner psyche was characteristic of the Surrealist painters, but the Surrealists were basically all about Freud. Dreams and so-called Freudian slips revealed the inner truth of our psyches, according to the school of thought, and our internal motivations were pretty much all about sexual drives. Post-war abstract expressionists were actually more taken with Freud's fellow psychologist and competitor, Carl Jung, who believed that human beings carry about what he called a collective unconscious that we share with all of humanity. So one example he gives of a collective unconscious is visions of damnation or hell, which cut across cultures. So, on to our first required work. De Kooning's work is also described as gestural or action painting. And in fact, he painted so vigorously and scraped off and started over so often that some of his canvases actually have holes in them. Still, there's an obvious difference between Woman 1 and Jackson Pollock's Autumn Rhythm, which you've just seen. And what is it? Well, there's an identifiable human figure here, right? By the way, your reading mentioned that he based his mouths on cigarette ads. Here's an example, and here is a quote from the artist. I think it's kind of interesting. Particularly, it turned out to be very beautiful, and it helped me immensely to have this real thing. Beautiful? Well, here are a couple more of de Kooning's women. They are certainly very distinctive, which means that I could imagine you being asked to identify a de Kooning painting that you've never seen on the AP exam. So what do you think? Is de Kooning channeling Jung or Freud? Well, I'd say probably both. Freudian psychology emphasizes women's sexual power over men and men's alleged sexual fantasies about their mothers. I find de Kooning's Women profoundly scaring, and I'm guessing that he found women scary too. In fact, here's an article from a quote from an article about de Kooning that appeared in The Guardian, which is a leading British newspaper. I quote, "This is a ballad of sexual frustration. If you had to visualize de Kooning's relationship to the woman, you would picture him trying to make polite conversation or ignoring her sitting across from him on the subway while desire pounded in his brain." Yeah, that sounds about right to me. But de Kooning's women are also archetypes, often a deliberate throwback to earlier, even prehistoric fertility image. So here we see a couple of prehistoric images. Our Tlatelolco female figurine, which is one of the required works, and the really more famous Venus of Willendorf, who I think really looks like one of de Kooning's women, or more accurately, de Kooning's women look a lot like the Venus of Willendorf. So let's hear from Sister Wendy again, and then I hope you'll take a moment to discuss your own reactions to this dramatic painting. So now we come to the third member of the famous New York triumvirate of abstract expressionists, another painter who surprisingly has dropped off the list, but who's too important for me to skip entirely. Again, we're looking at artists who had a lot of influence on those who came after them, including some that will be required. Rothko has a very distinctive style. It's referred to as color block painting, or sometimes chromatic expressionism as opposed to gestural expressionism or action painting. These are not action paintings. Rothko built his work slowly and carefully, layer by layer, but they are entirely abstract. Earlier abstract artists such as Kandinsky and Mondrian had offered at least a little explanation of the spiritual message that they intended to convey. Rothko got very snarky when he was asked to explain what his paintings meant, although he insisted that they were filled with meaning for those equipped to understand his paintings artistically and emotionally. If you didn't understand Rothko, well, you were just plain dumb, or at least you were emotionally stunted. If you're interested, Sister Wendy has a very good segment on Rothko from the very same video we've been watching. So this is a required work described as a color field rather than a color block painting. The artist made this and other works by pouring acrylic paint that was heavily diluted with turpentine onto unprimed canvas, which meant that the pigment would soak into the fabric. To move the color across the canvas and to vary its depth, she actually lifted the canvas itself so that the painting rolled around. This, notice, is very different from Rothko's meticulous layered technique of painting one layer of paint upon another. If anything, it's closer to Jackson Pollock's action painting, in that this artist allowed accident, or maybe the collective unconscious, to determine her final result. But like Rothko's work, this is a formalist painting. And so what do I mean by that? Very important, and I think actually somewhat confusing term. Oh, sorry, I just kicked my dog under the desk inadvertently. The focus of formalism is on the visual elements of the work and not its subject. In fact, Frankenthaler insisted that her colors did not stand for anything. She rejected illusionism in art quite explicitly, and she also rejected sentiment and emotion. The colors, she thought, spoke purely as color. Clement Greenberg was an artist who helped make the abstract expressionists famous, and he described her work as post-painterly abstraction. Let's unpack that. What does painterly mean, and what might post-painterly mean? It's a term you come across fairly often in the art world. I find it a little frustrating since all painting you would think is painterly. But to quote my old friend Wikipedia, an oil painting is considered painterly when there are visible brushstrokes, the result of applying paint in a less than completely controlled manner, generally without closely following carefully drawn line. In other words, these are paintings where the act of painting is very apparent. We talked about this, for example, with reference to Manet and the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists. By contrast, the works of, for example, the Italian Renaissance or the Baroque era are attempting, at least some of the Baroque works, are attempting to disguise the act of painting and to instead create a vision of reality. I would note that by the time we get to Rembrandt and also Velázquez, we're seeing more painterly art, more visible brushstrokes, more obvious act of painting. So it's an important distinction in art. any rate, Greenberg characterized post-painterly abstraction as being linear in design. This painterly tradition is less linear, more focused on shape and color. So also he saw post-painterly abstraction as open in composition. That's inclined to lead the eye beyond the limits of the canvas. I would say that was also true of Pollock's work, though not really of Rothkos. But most importantly, it was anonymous in its execution. It was not an attempt to express deep emotion. And in fact, the artists were really trying to leave behind the spirituality and also the grandiose drama, sometimes one would say even self-dramatization of abstract expressionism. Yet, as her title suggests, Frankenthaler was influenced by natural landscapes. So this is an earlier work. This is, in fact, her first soak stain canvas, another term for that technique. She painted mountains and sea after she returned from Nova Scotia. And while the painting is entirely abstract, it does reflect the painter's impressions of the Cape Breton landscape she'd been seeing. So she stated, and I quote, that the region's vistas were, quote, in my arms as I did it, unquote. On another occasion, she commented that, quote, my pictures are full of climates, abstract climates. They're not nature per se, but a feeling. So here's still another example for painting, purely abstract, yet informed by natural landscapes. So here's an interesting comment from the artist's New York Times obituary in 2011 when she died. Quote, critics have not unanimously praised Ms. Frankenthaler's art. Some have seen it as thin in substance, uncontrolled in method, too sweet in color, and too poetic. I'm guessing that the implied contrast, at least, is with the more famous and much more controlled works of Mark Rothko. So here, side by side, you see a Rothko on the left and our Frankenthaler required work on the right. What do you think? Is the bay too poetic, too sweet, or too uncontrolled? Which painting do you like better? So here are some more non-required examples of post-painterly abstraction from what's called the hard edge school for fairly obvious reasons. So rather than expressing emotion, these so-called hard edge paintings exude rationality. They remind me of Mondrian. So here's another artist and style that doesn't show up on the list anymore, but clearly influenced some of our required artists and even more our architects. Minimalists strove to reduce objects to their very simplest forms, exploring their physical qualities without trying to give them deeper meanings. Lots of basic geometric forms. I might compare it with suprematism, the movement in the early 20th century in what would be in Russia, what would become the Soviet Union. But remember that Malevich and other suprematists thought that there was a great deal of spiritual significance attached to that work. The minimalists are kind of backing off from that. Here are a couple more minimalist sculptures. Well, up until now, the artists we've looked at are taking themselves quite seriously, and now we can have a little fun. You've got the generational rebellion theme down by now, right? Well, the 60s generation of artists found their New York school predecessors somber, pretentious, and out of touch with popular culture. Did any of them, for example, ever listen to the Beatles? This work by Rauschenberger, pre-Beatles, by the way, was highly influential, though no longer required. And it is what is called a combine. Combines are works that combine sculpture and painting, as well often as Dada-style found objects. So note the pillow dangling from the string. Yes, it's part of the work. I mention that because we will encounter at least one combine among our required works, and in fact, we've seen this work before, and we'll talk about it more later in the unit. But notice how painting is combined with newspaper collage, is combined with found objects hanging on a clothesline. So I'm going to let Sister Wendy introduce us to pop art and to our next required work. No pop artist is more famous or more immediately recognizable than Andy Warhol. Is he celebrating American consumer culture? Is he making fun of American consumer culture? Maybe both. Note that Warhol not only parodies mass production, he also uses it as a technique. It is no accident and really no exaggeration that he called his studio the factory. So this is probably the image most closely associated with Warhol. Sorry, it's slightly blurry. Do you remember what a memento mori is? Why might this work be considered a memento mori? What is Warhol saying about death? What's he saying about popular culture? So I could easily imagine a question on Warhol's production process, which added color to silkscreen photographic images. Rather than try to explain this, I want you as a class to design your own virtual silkscreen. So here's the link. I wasn't able to email my final product to myself. I did create one. If you are able to, send it to me, okay? Our next required artist is another pop artist who celebrates and satirizes American consumer culture. The supersizing, if you will. Swedish-American artist Claes Oldenburg is best known for his gigantic plaster, resin, and cloth sculptures of food, clothing, and other ordinary items. If you're wondering what that item on the bottom right is, it is a typewriter eraser, and I'm actually old enough to remember them. Our required work has a rather more interesting story and a somewhat more serious theme. So, where was this work installed? So here's a description from the Yale Alumni Magazine about the story behind the work. Student protests were in full swing on campus during the spring of 1969, and amid almost daily demonstrations, these would have been demonstrations, by the way, against the Vietnam War, a monumental sculpture mysteriously appeared on the Beneke Palace. I may be pronouncing that wrong. The enigmatic artwork, a gigantic lipstick that stood 24 feet tall and appeared to be mounted on the body of a tank, was the creation of pop art sculptor Claes Oldenburg, class of 1950. Its presence in front of the World War I Alumni War Memorial inspired some, take that, those of you who think we should honor the war dead, and infuriated others. And it quickly became a focal point for anti-war demonstrations and for student rebellion. There was a lot of that going on at Yale in 1969. So the entire project was kept secret from the Yale authorities. Oldenburg inspected various campus sites, and he decided on the plaza. The form of the sculpture was suggested by a long orange balloon that he saw fluttering from a car parked near the site. On May 15th, the first day of final exams, just when students really need some distraction, I'm adding some of these comments, by the way, the clandestine plan was revealed when pieces of the 3,500-pound artwork were trucked onto the quadrangle. Initially, the lipstick tip was made of inflatable vinyl, but after being pumped up, it soon deflated and was later replaced by rigid plastic. Okay, guys, what else might the artist have been doing when he had a tip that deflated and was then reinflated? What kind of imagery are we talking about here? What is this pretty clearly resembling? Have I embarrassed you all enough yet? So, just a few other historical notes. The following fall, women entered Yale for the first time, and some saw this work as uniting masculine and feminine symbols. An interpretation that I would say was not especially flattering to either gender. Here's more from an alumni magazine. The original sculpture rather quickly began to fall apart, and it was removed from campus. A group of art professors and historians then organized to bring lipstick back to Yale as an important work of American art. Vincent Scully, who was master of Morse College, it's one of the colleges within Yale, enlisted the support of students and offered the college courtyard as a permanent installation site. Money was raised to restore the sculpture and construct new steel tracks. In the fall of 1974, lipstick was officially accepted by the art gallery and placed on indefinite loan to Morse College. It's now a campus feature and a good place, it appears, for a selfie. Which brings us to our last required work, Jeff Koons' Pink Panther. Now, I'm getting a little ahead of myself chronologically, but I think this work belongs with pop art. Why do I say this? What does this work have in common with the Maryland Diptych and Lipstick? And by the way, I've included with some other works by Jeff Koons. And now I'll ask a tougher question. Why do many critics who embrace Warhol and Oldenburg find themselves more uncomfortable with Koons? By the way, I'm going to post an interesting article on this subject from the New York Review of Books if anyone's interested in learning more. I thought it was a very good article. So one answer is that Koonings does not play the game of investing his art with deep meaning. He is pretty unabashedly in it for the bucks. And we are talking serious bucks here. In 2013, one of Koonings' balloon dogs sold for $58.4 million at a Christie's auction. Koonings himself denies that his work has any hidden meaning, or in fact that it's intended to critique modern culture, although art historians and art critics continue to insist that he must be meaning to critique modern culture. I mean, why else would he be doing this? But Koonings would say artists just want to have fun. He also employs a small army of assistants to help him mass produce these works, which again bring in major bucks. It is enough to make me want to go to art school. We're running out of time, but let me just make a few points about this totally in-your-face work. Technically, it involves more expertise than you might think at first glance. Koonings actually turned to European artisans to craft his designs in ceramic and to polychrome the exteriors. So the execution is actually considerably more careful than Warhol's. This work is part of a series. Do you remember the name of the series? Banalities. So what does banal or banality mean? Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines it as lacking originality, freshness, or novelty, and the synonym they give is trite. So here are some more works from the series. Along with an image of Hummel figure, Koonings claimed, that's on the right, claimed that these figures inspired his series. Essentially, he's celebrating kitsch, or again, to use a dictionary definition, art, objects, or design considered to be in poor taste because of excessive garishness or sentimentality. Koonings actually titled the work on the bottom left with the pig, Ushering in Banality. So Koonings was a stockbroker before he became a very, very rich artist, and he markets himself as vigorously as he markets his work. I'm going to end this podcast by flashing a series of now quite famous ads for art magazines that he made to promote his Banality series. They all feature, you guessed it, Jeff Koonings. So what message do you think he's sending with each of these ads? Here's the first. This one's especially subversive. Okay, you got to admit it. The man understands marketing. As we move on through this unit, I want you to think about the link between art and commercialism. Koonings is at least unabashed in his pursuit of fame and money. But many of our artists who intend their art to critique society are also making very serious money from the very people that they are claiming to mock. Is this hypocrisy or is it sweet revenge? Stay tuned.